can we start?
Yes, sure. You should please start.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. We are all here today to begin the Indian Governance Summit. This is the latest initiative of the Students Opinion Society to dive further into the world of public policy. The Students Opinion Society is the first student-run public policy think tank of IIT Kanpur that explores a range of political, philosophical, economic, and historic topics. Dr. 𝐕𝐈𝐑𝐀𝐋 Acharya has joined us today to talk about his upcoming book, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India, where he writes about the challenges India has been facing for several years in maintaining financial stability. We will also talk about his work in monetary policy, financial markets, and financial stability.
As a financial economist, Dr. Acharya's work is unique, with his mixture of outstanding theory, supporting empirics, and a deep interest in policy. Where he has worked beyond theory as the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India for over 2.5 years. He is currently the CV Star Professor of Economics at the NYU Stern School of Business and an academic advisor to the Federal Reserve Banks of New York and Philadelphia.
Before we begin, I would like to remind the audience that they can keep posing questions to Dr. Acharya in the questions section below, and we will be happy to take them up during the course of the discussion. Now let's call upon Dr. Acharya to talk about the challenges India faces in restoring financial stability. Thank you so much, sir, for taking the time out to talk to us.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot for inviting me, Ayushri and Manish. May I just request you to mute yourselves, the two of you, because I'm getting a lot of static sound actually in the background. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. A very good morning, I guess good evening to all of you. Firstly, I hope you and your families are keeping safe, well, and taking all the precautions in the midst of the outbreak. Unfortunately, the infection curve is still not looking right for India, but I hope it starts subsiding soon. We had our own share of fairly difficult wave within New York City itself, in March and April, but things finally seem to be subsiding. And I think that's something, I just wanted to convey something positive that it does come down eventually. So what I thought I'll do is explain a part of my fairly detailed introductory chapter in the book. By the way, the book is already released in end of July, so I hope some of you are able to get your hands onto it and look at it. I think there's a wealth of economics in it, explained in fairly simple terms, and yet relating to fairly complex policy issues. The preface chapter is called Fiscal Dominance, a Theory of Everything in India. And I thought I will mainly explain what fiscal dominance is in my initial remarks. And hopefully I can touch upon some of the reforms that might be necessary in the question and answer session. I left New York for Mumbai on the evening of 21st January 2017. As I sat at Newark Airport awaiting to board a United Airlines flight, I couldn't help reflect on the fact that the Indian banking sector was sitting on one of the highest non-performing loans to assets ratio among the G20 countries, and even among the group of emerging markets. This high non-performing loans to assets ratio, what is called as the GNPA ratio, the gross non-performing assets ratio, this was a marked departure from its standing in 2009. The poor capitalization of Indian banks from an economic standpoint had already been evident in the stock market data at least since 2013, because Indian public sector banks, they stood out as having particularly weak balance sheets in terms of their ability to withstand further stress. They had very low price to book ratios. And all of this could be seen in some of the measures we were calculating at New York University to assess the systemic risk of the Indian financial sector. So at that time, in January 17, it was obvious to most that financial stability of the banking sector and economic growth in India were at risk. Now, banking sector stress in India tends to play out somewhat silently. just as in China, where state-owned banks hold the majority of deposits and loans. This is because government ownership rules out that depositors will pull out their deposits from public sector banks, essentially run on public sector banks en masse, so collectively. And they don't do this even if the borrowers of these banks are defaulting en masse. And this is because they have a very strong explicit, in some cases implicit, sovereign guarantee that the depositors will be protected through taxpayer money. Now, this is considered by some as a positive backdrop for financial stability. And of course, this will work only unless and until the sovereign balance sheet solvency is itself considered to be on the brink. Nevertheless, these kinds of silent crises are still costly. Undercapitalization of public sector banks, combined with the lack of significant market discipline and possible behest lending, which is directed lending by the government, lends to a serious misallocation of credit. This is most commonly observed in the form of evergreening or zombie lending. Effectively, undercapitalized banks do extend and pretend of severely distressed or even defaulted borrower loans because they simply do not want to recognize that their economic capital is lost because of losses incurred on these loans. Now, when this kind of evergreening takes place on a massive scale and over a period of time, it is a phenomenon that is usually supported explicitly or implicitly by regulatory forbearance. In other words, the banking regulator turns a blind eye. Undercapitalized public sector banks are thus a significant cost to the healthier parts of the economy, even if these banks never witness bank runs. Such a silent crisis had been playing out in the Indian banking sector since at least 5 years, given the boom and bust of credit-driven fiscal stimulus post the global financial crisis of 2008. Could a push be made to address this unfortunate state of affairs in a decisive manner? As I was about to board the flight, I felt energized that if there were to be a meeting of minds on this issue with the Reserve Bank of India, and this fortunately turned out to be the case, then I could hit the ground running as soon as I reached Mint Street. I promptly sat down to make a checklist manifesto titled Restoring Financial Stability in India of the critical steps that we must undertake so that economic growth in India could in future be smooth sailing rather than a bumpy ride that it had become since the global financial crisis. My checklist manifesto was short, comprising just 2 bullet points. First, fix the health of the banking sector, especially that of public sector banks, with reforms such as consideration for a change of ownership, so the government diluting its stakes or simply handing over the banks in private hands, recapitalizing them, putting the weak public sector banks that had been underperforming under prompt corrective action, especially if they had a repeated track record of underwriting poor loans, a timely recognition of losses, and a decisive resolution of stressed assets. And second, develop financial markets to improve the efficiency of capital allocation in order to reduce the dependence of the system on bank credit and allow for market-based mechanisms to reward and punish the borrowers and the financial sector for its outcomes. How did we perform on these 2 fronts? It may be too soon to judge, but let me provide an assessment. On the first issue of the banking sector, we achieved moderate success in terms of fixing the health of the banking sector. In fact, within a year since I had joined, considerable progress had been made in restoring financial stability in India. The asset quality review initiated in 2014-15 had reached its conclusion. Bank assets had been marked more accurately for the losses incurred. The government of India had announced a significant recapitalization package for public sector banks with a plan to primarily reward healthier banks so that they could grow. Weaker public sector banks were put under the prompt corrective action framework, it was tightened to get closer to the framework of the United States. And most significantly, the resolution of large non-performing bank assets was put on a fast track on the back of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. At times, it seemed that even reprivatization of a few public sector banks may perhaps be on the table, given all these positive steps towards restoring financial stability. Now, everything seemed to be going well, with markets, rating agencies, and multilateral institutions recognizing the potential of these structural changes for financial stability as being a strong positive for India's long-term growth, as well as its sovereign credit rating. And yet, in about 10 months to follow, not only did progress stall, but also several policies regressed. Capital was injected in weaker rather than healthier public sector banks. Not much market capital was raised by any of these banks as originally envisaged. Capital standards and prompt corrective action framework were diluted. Forbearance in loss recognition crept in again for some asset classes. And the resolution of several non-performing borrowers under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was stayed. The central bank, at the same time, came under intense pressure to provide tremendous amounts of liquidity and open up the credit taps to loosen the strings on banks so that in spite of being undercapitalized, the public sector banks could start lending back to the economy. These pressures had to be and were resisted and reasoned against. And when I reflect on why this regression took place, a regression of efforts on the financial stability front, several questions kept coming to my mind and kept me up at nights. Why are efforts at restoring financial stability seen as contradictory to pursuing growth, even though all evidence points to financial stability being a necessary condition for long-term growth? Why does the central bank, when it seeks to implement financial stability reforms fully and sustainably, always face an uphill battle with the entire system? Is there a common undercurrent of resistance which makes it hard to achieve consensus on long-term structural reforms to the financial sector, even if they make much economic sense? And finally, does the pursuit of growth in India focus mostly on credit-based stimulus in the short run rather than genuine real sector or structural reforms of the financial sector? And is this focus on short-term credit-based stimulus is what causes efforts to restore financial stability to routinely stall? As I finished my term and started thinking about these questions, I realized that there was perhaps one uniform answer to all of these questions, and that was that India's financial sector policies suffer from a disease called fiscal dominance in economics. And I'm going to exaggerate and position this as a theory of everything in India. So what is fiscal dominance? Fiscal dominance in macroeconomics is defined as a state of a country in which large government debt and deficit, government deficit is simply what it spends over and above revenues. So fiscal dominance is a state in which large government debt and deficit prevent the monetary policy authority, such as a central bank, from meeting its mandated economic targets, such as inflation, growth, and employment. And why is this? Because instead of focusing on its mandated long-term targets, the central bank is kept focused instead on ensuring that the government can roll over its debt and deficit, and in particular that it does not default on its liabilities. In practice, it doesn't even have to be simply a default. It could just be the risk of a sovereign downgrade. So the central bank may accept very low levels of interest rate and high levels of liquidity injection in the economy, even if inflation is or risks being pushed beyond reasonable thresholds. The central bank does so as it is not focused on inflation, but on aiding the government's borrowing programs. Now, this kind of a macroeconomic state in which central bank is fiscally dominated, so the fiscal considerations are dominating its operations rather than its long-term objectives, this state is considered undesirable for the country, as very often governments are simply playing a T20, as I call it. Large-sized government debt and deficit tend to be driven by short-term populist pressures. It's very important for elected officials and bureaucracy to show that short-run growth numbers are high so that public perception about their performance is not adversely affected. However, a central bank is supposed to be playing a test match. It is mandated to achieve long-term stable objectives for the economy and the financial sector. Fiscal dominance of the central bank can thus be costly on several counts. First, as I explained, it prevents the central bank from staying focused on its long-run stability goals, such as protecting depositor interests, maintaining price or inflation stability, guarding the external sector or the value of the currency, in our case, the Indian rupee. Second, as I explained in the A.D. Shroff Memorial Lecture, which was given during my term and which is one of the essays in the book, central bank should really be seen as an independent checks and balances role that it should be performing in the economy to restrict the government from undertaking excessive borrowing and spending programs. What I mean is that just the way the judiciary, the election commission, enforcing the contracts in insolvency and bankruptcy court, just the way these are thought to be independent institutions to keep a democracy functioning with checks and balances, a central bank should also have operational autonomy and independence so that rather than facilitating the government's short-term actions, at times it should be able to lean against the wind and perform a checks and balances function against that role. Now, a central bank that is fiscally dominated would not be able to perform this function. Now, a key realization that I had during and after my term is that in India, fiscal dominance goes beyond monetary policy. The Reserve Bank of India is an all-purpose central bank. It performs not just monetary policy, but it also performs bank supervision, bank regulation. It manages the issuance of government debt. It designs the market rules for government bonds and the currency markets, external sector, and so on. And so let me explain two things first: why India is a case for fiscal dominance, why it's a very likely candidate. I'll do that very quickly. And second, I want to explain how specifically in the case of bank regulation, fiscal dominance plays a particularly perverse role. Okay, so just three simple facts. India runs a very high fiscal deficit. It's rather large. It's among the top 2 countries in the G20 nations. If you consolidate the fiscal deficit for the center, the states, and their public sector enterprises, on this consolidated basis, in fact, India's fiscal deficit is among the highest in the world, already above 10% of GDP pre-COVID and likely to hit 14.5% to 15% post-COVID. Now, much of this spending is on subsidies or revenue expenditures, and only a small share is attributable to capital expenditures. Why is this important? Because this highlights the T20 nature of government operations. Subsidies tend to boost short-term GDP of an economy. They have been shown not to contribute to growth on a sustainable basis in the long term. In contrast, capital expenditures such as investments in infrastructure have been shown to have large fiscal multipliers in the long run for the economy. Unfortunately, in India, over long stretches of time, more than 90% of the central government's budget and more than 70 to 75% of the state government's budget is simply based on revenue expenditures, not on capital expenditures, and they don't contribute that significantly to long-term economic growth. Second, because the government of India borrowing is now so large because of these large deficits, it dissaves more than what the rest of the economy saves. In India, the household sector is a net saver, the corporate sector is a net borrower, and the government of India is also a net borrower. Now, what the government of India borrows net from the rest of the economy is larger than the savings of the households in the economy. So both the government of India and the corporate sector are essentially reliant on external financing as far as funding the marginal expenditures is concerned. So India effectively also runs a current account deficit. These twin deficits, the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit, make India vulnerable to sudden stops. What are sudden stops? If there is a deterioration of government or corporate balance sheets in India, if inflation rises, either due to domestic stimulus, which is common during elections, or because there's an oil price shock globally, if there is a Federal Reserve rate hike or dollar absorption by the Fed, which triggers global risk aversion, all of this can trigger a situation in foreign investors vote by their feet and pull out the funding of the Indian government and the corporate sector. Then you get a sharply depreciating Indian rupee, the imported oil bill rises, so does imported inflation, current account deficit widens further, the government can't keep charging higher and higher oil taxes in order to balance its budget, so the fiscal deficit rises as well, and you ultimately get a possible loss of confidence on India as an investment place. Now, so these kinds of risks materialize unexpectedly at least once every decade. And I would say there are smaller sneezes along the way as well. Now, why is this backdrop important? This backdrop is important because one way that the government can try to address problems of large debt and deficit is to undertake tough structural adjustments of its own. It can spend on infrastructure instead of giving so many subsidies when we are not yet a rich country. It can simply do less, for example, by combining inefficient subsidies and instead providing a universal basic income as a direct transfer to the households, because there would be a lot of reduction in wastage because so many entities are running in India simply to provide the subsidies. All of these entities and their financial costs can be wound down if instead you just make a universal basic income as a direct transfer to the households. But instead, what the government tends to do is that subsidies are popular. They allow the government to come up with a variety of programs. These programs are advertised and branded in a populist manner for changing public perceptions. And as I said, they don't add to the long-run growth of the economy. So what the government does to continue with its populist programs is to do what is more expedient, which is to economically and financially repress the economy and the financial sector regulators so that its own borrowings are always conveniently financed by the rest of the economy. And then you get a virtually pervasive, all-encompassing financial dominance of the central bank and other regulators. Now, while some of these pressures, a T20 versus a test match horizon of decision making between the government and the central bank, they exist in other parts of the world also. But in India, we have two conflating factors. First, we have a very large presence of public sector banks, large state-owned financial institutions such as the Life Insurance Corporation of India, and also other state-owned enterprises for financing sectors such as power. The presence of all these entities means that it's very quick for the government, a temptation to turn to the central bank in order to skew the rules in favor of these entities. It always stacks the odds against the private sector because the government is looking for concessions for its own borrowing and the balance sheets of these government-owned entities. Now, second, when the private sector of an economy gets crowded out, it has this really bad and perverse, almost cancerous outcome that the private industrialists, entrepreneurs they also now want to start primarily looking for concessions from the regulators. Instead of creating value through their business models, they start participating and developing a culture of having business policies which are friendly to the current set of businesses. They don't want to hand over their assets even after default. They don't want new entry into the sectors, and they don't push for genuine ease of doing business on the ground, because instead they start doing rent extraction by getting favors from the government and the financial regulators. Now, there is an important macroeconomic backdrop, which is that since 1991, India has become a more decentralized, liberalized economy. Prior to that, in 70s and 80s especially, India was a nationalized, centralized economy. As Dr. Y.V. Reddy, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, describes in his masterful foreword of the book, that in 70s and 80s, the government, the Reserve Bank of India, and the public sector banks could function like a Hindu undivided family in which no one kept anyone's proper accounts. But this is no longer the scenario. We have a private sector, we have a private financial sector. And so if the public sector banks, the government, and the RBI function as a Hindu undivided family, they won't allow the private sector to grow. They won't allow the private sector to borrow. And we will simply regress back to the what is called as the Hindu rate of growth of 70s and 80s as 3.5%. My fear is that after the liberalization and the divestment gains of 90s and early 2000s have now been exhausted, we seem to be reversing gradually back to this nationalized, centralized era of decision making. And this fiscal dominance of the central bank that comes with it could be a big concern. So let me explain in what ways fiscal dominance permeates beyond monetary policy to affect bank regulation. And I'll give two concrete examples. First, I'll focus on how bank regulation is always compromised to relax bank capital rules. And second, I will discuss why defaults by Indian borrowers, especially large industrial firms, are never disclosed in a timely manner to markets and citizens. Okay, now note that if you recognize losses in a timely manner, then public sector banks would have to acknowledge that they lent money, but it has not come back. So their equity capital has incurred some losses. This would mean that the government would need to inject additional capital into public sector banks. If space has to be created for this capital in the government budget, the government, which is already stretched fiscally, would have to compromise on some of its popular subsidy programs. Now, the government doesn't want to do that. So what does the government do? It does what I call as phone central banking. In phone banking, the governments used to tell bankers where to lend. In phone central banking, the government tells the central bank how to design financial sector policies in order to aid its populist programs. So the central bank finds itself pulled into regular negotiations with the government regarding what I call as regulatory forbearance. What is regulatory forbearance? It means relaxed standards for loan loss recognition, very delayed schedules for injecting equity and providing for losses which have already occurred, postponement in switching to modern accounting standards that recognize losses in a smooth, anticipated manner rather than backloading the problem and recognizing losses only after the money has already been lost. In some asset classes, such as micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, it's a very populist asset class. It's important to keep them happy to get their votes. For this asset class, the forbearance over the last 5 years has not just been a temporary reprieve of few months where the banking sector is asked to make a one-off concession, but in fact, it has become a near permanent feature of bank regulation because there's a forbearance every year, sometimes twice in a year. Essentially, the fact that textiles gems and jewelry and several other sectors in India in the MSME space have a structural problem that they are not able to compete with the rest of the world with productivity gains that the rest of the world has. This has been ignored because you are just constantly making it cheap for them to get credit and not have to actually repay their credit on time. Now, worse, because the banks are never capitalized on time, most public sector banks always remain short of true economic capital adequacy. And what all that gets done is that their accounting book gets managed with the help of the central bank to just look about right. Rating agencies don't view such forbearances as credit positive, they view them as credit negative, highlighting that forbearances do not serve the purpose of ensuring financial stability. And in fact, what happens is that these banks, first, they want to evergreen, so they lend even more money to defaulted borrowers. And because they don't have much growth capital, they don't make new loans and certainly not at attractive rates to healthier parts of the economy. So borrowing costs in India are higher in private sector and for individuals than they are in most parts of the world. In fact, I saw some recent numbers that they are higher even than in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And one has to understand why this is so. It's because a part of our banking system is always undercapitalized, and this is facilitated through a fiscal dominance of the central bank's regulatory policies. Second, why are defaults by industrial borrowers in India not disclosed on time? One would think that a stock exchange should require the disclosure of defaults because stockholders, minority investors should know how well the company is doing. Is it managing its liquidity well? Is it paying its bills on time? And yet in India, this information is not provided to the mom and pop investors to assess their companies in a timely manner. And this is in spite of a clear recommendation by an independent committee and earnest efforts of the securities market regulator. Why is this? Because if the defaults by industrial houses were recorded, then these firms would get downgraded by rating agencies. Once downgraded, banks would have to recognize that defaults are more likely on these loans. They would have to start providing slightly greater capital against these losses. Anticipated losses. That would increase the capital requirement of public sector banks. This would have to come out of budget and it would have to squeeze into some of the populist programs. But because this doesn't have to happen, you turn to the securities market regulator and say that there is no need to require default disclosures when defaults have taken place, at least not for a month. Okay. What this means is that India's default disclosure policy is rather weak. Firms don't manage their liquidity very well. They are happy to miss payments for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and banks have absolutely no recourse. And there is no market discipline because the disclosures are not being provided. So this kind of fiscal dominance of the central bank's supervisory and regulatory policies means that financial stability in India always is like a tight rubber band. It's always pulled so stretched that it can snap at any moment when unexpected pressure gets applied on it because of inevitable economic shocks or shocks to the global financial system. So I will end my remarks here. I'm happy to discuss the proposals to reduce the impact of fiscal dominance. But let me just mention this one quote by Federal Reserve Governor Janet Yellen, who famously noted in January 2009, she was on the board of governors at that time, and then she was the Federal Reserve Governor from 2014 to 18. Or 13 to 17, I guess. What was her message? She said that a clear lesson of history is that a sine qua non for sustained economic recovery is a thoroughgoing repair of the financial system. And there's an important message herein for India. What India has been doing since 70s, 80s, and especially 90s is that every time lending to an asset class blows up, Instead of cleaning it up and recapitalizing the financial system as a thoroughgoing repair, instead of doing that, India simply asks banks to throw money at another asset class. It works with the central bank to not recognize the losses of the previous boom and bust cycle. And instead, it simply gets the banks to lever up to another asset class. Then that asset class goes belly up because undercapitalized banks don't lend well. They don't lend to the right borrowers or at the right costs. So this repeated strategy of simply levering up without ever cleaning up has now derailed Indian economy's long-term growth plans because there is no sector left in the economy to lever up anymore. Structural reforms are now critical. All of these problems, the likelihood of bank losses, the likelihood of sectors getting into trouble, all of these problems have become much worse with COVID-19. The government fiscal deficits are likely to rise as well. And therefore, the fiscal and the financial stability need to be restored in India over a medium-term path, credibly, with commitment, and right away, in my view. I provide some paths to do this in the book, and I hope you are able to look at some of this. And I'm happy to answer some questions in the remaining time.
Sir, in your book, you mentioned that after your first year at RBI, you saw considerable progress in restoring financial stability in India, be it the recapitalization of banks, PCA norms, and the fast tracking of insolvency and bankruptcy code. But in the year to follow, there were a lot of differences with the government. Several of the measures were retracted, and there was an attempt to alter the governance structure of the RBI. And what we were wondering is whether it is an uphill task for almost all central banks to implement these sort of progressive measures. And how do you think have other developed economies fared with this problem of government supervision or intervention, so to say?
Yeah, that's a great question. Three things. First, as Dr. Reddy also explains in his foreword to the book, and I explain at length in the A.D. Shroff Memorial Lecture, the letter of the law, which is the RBI Act, is extremely weak in guarding the operational autonomy of the central bank. Now, for a while, this didn't matter because in 70s and 80s, the RBI was basically part of this Hindu undivided family with the government and the public sector banks. But now it matters because we have a private financial sector, we have private firms. The aspirations of Indian youth are very high. We can't just grow at negative rates or even 4% and 5% to create the right quantum of jobs for our newly graduating youth. If we are to get more of the agricultural labor to get skilled and enter the higher paying jobs, we need to be growing at 8 to 9% per annum. So for that, we need that the rules of the game are not always being skewed in favor of the government and the public sector entities because they are not going to be able to generate the 8 to 9% growth on their own. They need to strike the right balance with the private sector of the economy, with the private financial sector, and give the central bank some operational space so that the rules are not always being skewed in favor of the government and the public sector banks. So that's one critical point. The second point is, so what I'm trying to say is that the demographic needs for growth in the Indian economy are very different than they are in the advanced economies because they are just not growing as rapidly as we are, and therefore they don't have to create as many jobs as quickly as we do. Second is the fact that because of this weakness of the RBI Act and because of the problems that the Nationalization Act overrides even the limited powers that the RBI and the Bank Regulation Act have, the central bank is not able to regulate public sector banks in the same way that it regulates private sector banks. See, private sector banks also have problems. There are governance failures there also. But when that happens, the central bank is at least able to get the management out, ensure that there are other ways of getting capital injection in. But with public sector banks, all these powers reside with a Department of Financial Services in the Finance Ministry. So basically, we have dual control of these banks as far as their regulation is concerned. In this respect, India is much closer to China than the developed economies or other emerging markets. Now, note that China is different. It is very centralized, even though it has allowed markets now to start functioning. But it has a much more efficient bureaucracy than the Indian economy does, because India is still decentralized in terms of the operations between the center and the states and so on. And so we are trying to push on a Chinese model of growth without actually necessarily being China in the way we are organized as a state, as a democracy. And I think this is a problem, because then the central bank, which should be performing that important decentralized function of supervision, regulation, governance, ensuring good governance of these public sector banks, simply can't function because the Department of Financial Services has some of the powers. And as I said, anyway, they engage in a lot of phone central banking, which is they try to fiscally dominate the central bank's rules. So that's second problem, which is that the overarching presence of the state in the financial system makes the problem of fiscal dominance in India far worse than it is in developed economies. And the third point I would say, and this is the crucial point, that everyone tells me, oh, what are you talking about fiscal dominance? The Fed and the US Treasury are working together. Bank of Japan and the Japanese government are working together. And, you have these crazy academic notions of fiscal dominance and so on. I think the point is that they are doing this in the midst of COVID. They are not doing this in normal economic times. In India, every year, the pressures on the central bank are as though we are in a crisis. And that's because the government is always playing a T20 in its focus on short-term growth. They want every single growth print that comes out to actually look to be very good and healthy. But sometimes when you undertake structural measures, such as repairing your financial sector, you have to accept a short period of stress, like 2009 and 10 in the United States after the global financial crisis. But then you restore your financial sector to such health over the next few years that even if a shock like COVID hits, your banks are not going to be at risk. Now, that's the situation of the United States banking system right now. So we can't really take heart in the fact that the Fed and the US Treasury are working together in the midst of COVID, because actually their financial sector is at such high levels of capitalization right now that there is no need to compromise the policies of the central bank to a level where financial stability would get compromised. Instead, as I said, even in a normal year, our financial stability is, as I keep giving this example, it's like a tight rubber band that, with a little bit of extra pressure, will start actually snapping. So sometimes I like to give for financial stability, I always like these analogies because that's how I mentally think about all these issues. See, you think about how engineers build bridges. They leave a lot of extra buffers in the trusses that are added in the bridges. Why? Because a bridge should be able to withstand hurricane, cyclonic style of winds without collapsing. I think of the financial sector as a bridge. It's a bridge from the savers to the borrowers in the economy. Now, this bridge has to keep functioning at all times, regardless of what the external conditions are. Maybe sometimes it is the winds are too strong and you have to have a temporary closure, but the bridge should still not collapse. Now, imagine if those who are laying down the rules of the design of these bridges say that we want to cut costs and we really don't want this bridge to actually have too many extra trusses so that it can withstand this hurricane and cyclonic winds. Then as soon as the winds get to be strong, your bridges will collapse. It will take a while to build these bridges up again. And for that entire period when the bridges have collapsed, the savings from one shore will not be able to reach the borrowings on the other shore as well. And this is what I mean by financial stability, that when short-term fiscal pressures ask the financial regulator to cut corners in the design of these bridges, we are just constantly doing repair. We are not able to function in an efficient manner where we can amplify the productivity on the two shores of the economy. Instead, we are simply repairing our bridges all the time because we are never building them with adequate strength.
So, sir, I have read some of your comments in the MPC meeting minutes, and somehow every time you would be a bit more skeptic than the others in decreasing the repo rate. You would be more objective oriented and aim towards price stability and boosting growth. Since you have departed, the MPC has been very dovish in cutting rates. And going by recent reports, the RBI is facing the grim prospect of answering to the parliament for failing to achieve its inflation target for 3 consecutive quarters. Do you believe that this dovish stance of the central bank has led to this failure in achieving its objectives?
I haven't analyzed the data as closely as I could have when I was at the central bank, because you just don't have access to all the models and so on. Of course, as you know, I did not support the first rate cut. I think in February of 18. I forget now whether in April, maybe in April there was another rate cut, and I didn't support. I don't remember now. But finally in June, before I left, I did support 125 basis points rate cut. But I wrote 4 pages of minutes, if some of you recall, explaining why I thought it was a very, very tough call. So my approach to this is very simple. I don't have to do what I want to do. I have to do what I have been asked to do. The inflation targeting framework is a law. It's an amendment of the RBI Act, which says that the central bank has to strive to maintain 4% inflation in a band of plus minus 2% while paying attention to growth. To me, it's very clear that the primacy of the objective is price stability or inflation, as per the wording of this legislation. And the caveat or the secondary objective is that you while paying attention to growth. Now, what happens is different central bankers always differ in their assessment of how much weight to put on the primary objective versus the secondary objective. So therefore, there are the doves, as you said, and then there are the hawks. The hawks are actually putting a lot of weight. My view is that I was neither a dove nor a hawk, to borrow like a popular analogy. I was functioning more of, my job was more that of an owl, actually. It was to stay up at nights when other people were sleeping, to see whether there were unexpected shocks that may actually cause us to not perform our required legislative mandate. I think this was always my main concern, that are we delivering on the mandate? Because see, this is the democratic accountability, because we are not elected officials of the people of India. We are appointed by the government. The government is the elected body. Through the legislations, the government has given these unelected officials certain powers and certain constraints. So they have given us a very specific mandate. They have told us a very specific tool, which is the policy repo rate. And they are going to hold us to be democratically accountable, because in every minute we have to explain why each person voted the way they did, given this mandate. So this is the democratic accountability process. And my sense is it is not my business to start interpreting what the people of India wanted when they agreed indirectly to a particular legislative mandate. The legislative mandate is what it is, and I have to basically respect it in my decisions. What was my concern last year? My concern last year, you will see it repeatedly in my minutes, that the food price inflation was quite low. And I thought it likely had only one direction to go from then on. I was also concerned about oil prices, because they rise very unexpectedly. But of course, because of COVID, the oil prices have actually collapsed. In fact, they've recovered a bit, but they collapsed very sharply around March of this year. So one of my concerns did not materialize. But I think COVID has created supply side pressures in India. And so there was another inflationary pressure that has got manifested. But I think the inflation started rising even pre-COVID, actually, since November, mainly because of food inflation. And I think this was my primary risk that I was highlighting. So, and I think it's the same, it's this bridge analogy that I keep giving. See, my question was always that our adherence to the legislative mandate should stay robust even if some winds like this actually hit us. And so I think certainly food inflation is not possible for everyone to control. But I think what the central bank can do is to foresee when food inflation is likely to be high, because if it is at rock bottom levels, one has to realize that historically then it has had a tendency to rise back up again. And that means you have to anticipate this and leave some buffers. Now, of course, you have to make some sacrifices of growth at times, because that is the only way a central bank builds credibility. What is credibility? Credibility is that even in the face of fiscal dominance pressures, when there is temptation to support the government borrowing programs, the central bank will guard against inflation and not do as much as it can if it were to be fiscally dominated. Now, of course, the markets are not going to wait for your actions, because you would have built a credibility or commitment with them, and they will have an expectation of how you are likely to act. See, therefore, people are reading our minutes so carefully because they want to understand what the thinking is in the minds of these MPC members, so that they can form expectations and price likelihood of future rate hikes or rate cuts accordingly in determining the bond yields. So how do you build credibility? You build credibility when you show that sometimes you are willing to take the pain of a short-term growth reduction in order to stick to your legislative mandate of targeting the 4% inflation. So to me, that is the way the central bank should approach. And I feel very strongly that as we come out of COVID and the government borrowing needs are very, very large, if the central bank has to monetize their deficits directly or indirectly, which is either participate directly in the primary market or support the bond markets in the secondary market through open market purchases, what's very crucial is that the central bank maintain its inflation credibility. Because if it is perceived that the central bank will react at the right time when inflation starts getting out of control and growth impulses pick up again, if it is believed that the central bank will respond at that time, then the cost of borrowing right now will not go up as much as they would otherwise. I think as of now, the gains that were made in the first 4 years are still there. And I think we should persevere with the Monetary Policy Committee and the flexible inflation targeting framework that's been given to it.
Oh, okay, so thank you for your really deep insight. So maybe I'll just take a question from the chat. So
Sure.
It's that after 1991 reforms, Indian market was open to foreign investors, which sort of boomed the economy. This current government is sort of moving opposite to this idea by creating difficult regulations for foreign investors and manufacturers. Maybe is referring to the Chinese side. So what are your opinions on this one?
Yeah, see, I would say broadly, India has been on a steady path of liberalizing the external sector, both in terms of capital flows as well as the current account. And it's gradual, it's calibrated, because as I told you, we have a twin deficit problem of fiscal deficits and current account deficit. So we can have these sudden stop risks materializing every now and then. Now, and in fact, some of this is seen. Our FPI flows have been very robust. Our foreign direct investments into our companies have also been very robust, especially over the last 2-3 years. You know, the China situation is partly political, it's partly strategic, given the border issues that are involved. I do think, though, that economic warfare in the midst of COVID could mean that we take on too much in terms of trying to resurrect the economy, because a lot of the Chinese imports are intermediate goods into the production of our exporting companies. A lot of the Chinese material that we import cannot readily be provided in India. Some of the Chinese manufactured goods that we import, we don't yet have good production capacity for those goods in India. So without that, what will mean is that Chinese imports will actually add further, restricting Chinese imports or throwing sand in the wheels of them coming in easily will actually put further pressure on inflation in the country. And if it hurts our exports, it might also mean that our growth actually doesn't do as well. So my sense is that it may be better to keep the two separate, work out the strategic issues on the border through statesmanship, but keep economic warfare on the side for now, because the fear I have is that we are already in a very deep contraction because our infection curve from the virus doesn't look as good. And, we have to do relief and repair. And for this, we need as much support from the global economy as possible in stimulating our growth, rather than actually creating our own barriers and headwinds in getting the support of the global economy. Because let's be honest, China is perhaps the only country which has a very benign infection curve right now. It's the only country that has grown positively amongst the large countries in the last quarter. So we need actually the support of whoever is generating growth in the global economy right now, rather than to, kind of put barriers at our borders and take on too much to do in order to repair the economy in the short run.
Sir, here's another question. It's from Dhananjay from IIT. He writes that isn't the strategic disinvestment the same like a T20 match in which government would get short-term profit by selling PSUs, while it would have been a test match approach where the structural issues of PSUs and PSBs should be solved? He wants your...
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Reprivatization or divestments are not a panacea to improve the functioning of these organizations. Some of these organizations have been public now for almost 50 years. So there is a very deep cultural, I would say to some extent, lethargy, lack of incentives, poor risk management, a lack of performance incentives, etc. inside these organizations. The labor is used to functioning in a certain way and used to a certain style of perks without delivering much in terms of the bottom line. So I absolutely agree. As far as public sector banks are concerned, my preferred approach would be that first the government divest its stakes below 50% to 25 or 30% as recommended by Narasimhan committee in 90s and then the PJ Nayak committee in 2014. Why does this first step need to be taken? Because the recapitalization needs are there, because COVID losses will rise and government doesn't have space fiscally to actually spend too much from its borrowing programs on all this. Then during the phase of these divestment, in parallel, the government needs to make efforts to improve the governance of these entities. First, it has to be operationally at a distance, not be telling the public sector banks where to lend and how much and set lending quotas and things like that. It has to empower the boards by appointing powerful independent board members. And it has to put in place performance-based incentives. And maybe it has to maybe when it divests its stakes, it can look for significant stakes being acquired by institutional owners or even a private bank that can bring in some fintech, digital, and this kind of expertise for both product creation as well as risk management inside these entities. Many of these banks require a fairly significant technological overhaul in their operations. And then during this period when governance, operations and risk management are improved, a calibrated plan could be put in place for eventual reprivatization. Now, note that some of the public sector banks are already healthy and perhaps they could be reprivatized even right away. But the weaker ones may even need a specialization of the business model. I look at some of the microcredit and microfinance institutions that have now evolved into small payment banks and one into a very, very large bank, which is valued very sort of at healthy levels in the stock market, presumably because its growth prospects are very bright. Why can't some of the weaker public sector banks perform this kind of profitable but socially valuable function of lending to the last mile. For 50 years, we have been saying we need public sector banks because the country is poor and we need development and financial inclusion. But why is it that most of their bad loans are actually in terms of loans to large industrial firms? I think there is a paradox here. Because I think it must be that we have not been asking them to do primarily financial inclusion. We are probably doing something else. And this is the real problem with public sector entities. I think in the end, while reprivatization and divestments are not a panacea, the reason why they are required is because the government needs to distance itself from the operations of these entities. Because until the government doesn't distance itself, there is always mission creep. There is always a year, every few years in India, when it is felt that public sector banks can be used to achieve your T20 objectives. And the credit misallocation cost that occurs from that short-term pressure, in my view, is far greater than some costs you may suffer from the fact that even a private entity at times is not governed well. As I said, a central bank has powers to fix those problems in a private bank, but it doesn't have these powers right now to fix these problems. And so you can see the problems of public sector banks, they look very uniform. They all have the same problems. And it's because the same business model, the same practices, the same short-term pressures to overlend apply to all of them at different points of time. So you don't get this organically differentiated, diverse banking system. You just get replicas of one by one the same entity in different balance sheets. And then when errors occur, therefore, all the errors look exactly the same. And you have a systemic risk or a silent crisis playing out all at once.
I think touching the R mark, so I'll just take the final question and then we can end the session. So sir, its question is a little personal, and so Dr. Acharya, you are I would say, a very candid personality, and you have openly questioned the government for its intervention in the central bank, while most of the people would wait for their retirement. And how do we, as the youth, get the courage to speak out when in the current context, we see so many people being targeted, to just what they say. So, what would be your, advice to?
Yeah. See, my sense is I'm only interested in. I had a certain interpretation of my job as a central banker. As I told you, for me, it was all about the legislative mandate. It was all about whether a central bank is trying to perform what has been legislatively asked for it to perform under the RBI Act or the MPC Act or whatever the related amendments were. And you have to do what it takes to do that. If it means leaning against the wind, if it means speaking truth to power, if it means sometimes playing the game of chicken on not giving in as easily, I think you have to do it. You have to use your minutes, you have to use your speeches, which is a part of the democratic accountability of the central bank, as a way to raise issues and create public debate. See, at some level, a central banker is powerful, but at another level, they are not, because the ultimate law writing authority resides somewhere else, right? So a central banker can only sometimes be an advocate for change. A central banker can't always do all the changes himself or herself. Second was perhaps a somewhat selfish motive. I like to sleep well. And I always thought that if I had a regret that I could have done something about an issue and I didn't do it, you are bothered in the night about not actually putting your best foot forward. So I always thought that if I have no regrets at the end of the day, then maybe hopefully I can sleep well, wake up and start afresh all over again. The last point I would say is that my views on public sector banks and bank regulation were public even before I joined the Reserve Bank of India. In fact, even in the acknowledgements, I thank the government of India for giving me a chance to perform this role in the first place. I don't think it was that much of a surprise to anyone as to where I came from on the bank regulation issues. So I think you have to raise the right issues at the right point of time. I think that whatever opportunity you get, you have to give it your best. Sometimes it means saying no, having disagreements, And I think if we don't have disagreements, we often don't debate the right issues and we don't find the right path. So I think I only mean well for everyone in India. I think one should not underestimate the difficulty that the policymakers and the government faces right now in the midst of COVID. I think the challenges are truly massive, both at the center as well as at the state level. On the ground on health front. So as much as it's easy for me to sit and keep commenting on these issues, the idea is that debating these issues will ultimately help everyone in the system find the right path. But clearly, the challenges are many, and one should not underestimate the difficulty of policy making in such a circumstance.
Okay, so thank you for your comments. So with that, I would just like to conclude with this, that the financial stability and economic growth of India, as pointed out, is already at risk, with Indian banks having the largest highest NPAs. And the COVID-19 pandemic has also created one of the biggest challenge India has faced in history. So Dr. Acharya's vision and wisdom in his book, communicated in a passionate and provocative way, can help us understand the reasons behind this risk and how effective policy can help tackle them.
So all Dr. Acharya's proceeds will go towards Pratham, an organization that aims to improve the quality of education in India. The book is also available on all leading platforms, and I hope you read and like it. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I wish you all and families the very best. I hope you enjoy reading the book or parts of it. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll try my best to get back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All the best. Take care.
Thank you.